as we kind of conclude, as you know, this symposium was generously sponsored by the Scandinavian Studies Department, and we really wanted to let them have an opportunity to give us some remarks. So we'd like to invite both Nate Kramer and Christopher Oscarson to give us a word. Nate Kramer is the Associate Professor of Comparative Arts and Letters and the Director of the Scandinavian Studies here at BYU. And Christopher Oscarson is also an Associate Professor of Comparative Arts and Letters at BYU, specializing in Scandinavian and environmental literature and film. I believe Dr. Kramer does more with Norway and Dr. Oscarson with Sweden, but a deep love for all things Scandinavian for both of them, right? So we'll let Dr. Kramer and Dr. Oscarson give us a word.
My colleague has the more difficult job of actually giving a presentation. I get the more pleasurable one of simply thanking Jana Lee and Mark Magleby. It's been very kind of you to include us in this, include the Scandinavian Studies program at BYU in the symposium, and in the invitation to Marta Fjellestad. So it's been great to have you, Marta, here. We've enjoyed so much these last few days. Her visit actually coincided with the Loftur Bjarnason lecture, and this has been postponed for the last several years because of COVID. So it's been very nice to have her come and renew this. Loftur Bjarnason was a former professor of literature at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and a visiting professor here at BYU, and he donated some funds to BYU, which we have benefited enormously from those funds, and part of that is having Marta here with us. So thank you to her, thank you to the Museum of Art for making all this possible. And I should also mention, this is an added benefit. It's been so wonderful to get to know and become acquainted with Shannon and with Ron and Kathy and with Spencer as well. So thank you.
Well, I just want to echo my thanks as well, and for the opportunity to join the program. One of the things that stood out to me is the serendipity that, and maybe this is, those of you who deal with these kinds of exhibits and going around, that these particular people found each other, and the way that things come together to create these exhibits. It's really it's inspiring. But it's frustrating too to find out that my colleague James Swenson, who has a door 5 doors down from me, is working on something that that we have pretty closely in common, that I had no idea that he was working on until relatively recently. I'm going to change my comments. I'd prepared some comments based on some of the research that I've done. I work on early cinema, and I was really struck in engaging this material about what a debt early cinema pays to the work of the photographers in the late 19th century. And some of the work that I've done has to do with the tourist associations and the way that they fostered and encouraged photography, both by professional photographers, but especially by amateur photographers. And that this became a really important part. They're feeding on each other, this tradition, that then goes on, and you see the marks of it, both in American cinema as well as in Scandinavian cinema, that these are the two cinemas that more than any other, I would argue, have an engagement with landscape in a fairly significant way. And of course, in the American context, it's the Western that eventually emerges coming out of the late teens, and the Western has died several times, but it never really dies. It just keeps coming back. But it really hits its stride with people like John Ford, and the way that he takes cinema outside in Monument Valley and other places. And it's about this kind of engagement with the landscape that we see being presented to us first already in the 19th century. There's something very similar going on in Scandinavia. Now, Norway does not have much of a silent film tradition to speak of. It's a very small and limited one. Its resources were fairly limited, but you can definitely see the way that this plays out in Sweden. And in the case of Sweden, they're in the middle of World War I, they make a very deliberate production strategy decision to start doing more literary adaptations, fewer films of higher quality. And one of the hallmarks of these films is they go outside, they go on location. And again, they're drawing very heavily on the visual tradition that's been started and really pioneered by these tourist associations. That's all I'm going to say about that. And I'll kind of leave that to the side. And instead, I'll just take a couple minutes to act as respondent of sorts to what we've heard here. And I'm in a position to do that precisely because James didn't bother to tell me about what was going on. So I come at this a little bit from the outside. But this will give us a few minutes for question and answer, which I think is important. One thing that I think is really significant to point out about why this particular exhibit is important is that the exhibit is about seeing landscapes, and interest in seeing landscapes and a new place for the human. And it's trying to negotiate this idea of a new place for human. And several of the speakers today have mentioned this. In the American context, it manifests itself as, well, in terms of manifest destiny, right? And a kind of a colonization of the West. It's both a technological conquering of the land as well as an exploration. It's an erasure, of course, of the history that already exists to create the illusion of a tabula rasa, something that can be shaped in the service of the new nation. It's rewriting this history and the creation of a mythology. In Scandinavia, there's something very similar going on, that Scandinavia in the late 19th century is finding itself for the first time. And again, there's several of the speakers pointed to this in different sorts of ways, that we get an artistic painterly tradition in the mid-19th century that begins to paint Nordic landscapes for the first time. Now, there have been paintings of ostensibly Nordic landscapes before, but of course, they're really Southern European landscapes that are being painted and being labeled as from the North. But it's really the 19th century where there's an attempt to represent the uniqueness of the landscape, not its similarity to Southern European landscapes. And this becomes fundamental for, again, writing a new kind of history. For Sweden, it was coming to grips with the fact that it was not a military power in the north anymore, that had once colonized the Baltic, that it needed to find its definition in other places, in other ways. And it was this inner colonization of its own territory that had scarcely been recognized by mainstream Swedish cultures. Of course, the Sami knew exactly what was in the interior. They had been there for a long time, but from the viewpoint of Stockholm, not so much. A similar thing is going on in Norway as they get a new constitution and freedom from Denmark in 1814, only to land in a union with Sweden. And this budding Norwegian nationalism was looking for ways to define who and what they were, and nature was an obvious place to start. It was what had marginalized them historically now becomes the privileged site of their identity. What you see going on in the photographs is this aestheticization of environments that's so important. It's shaping how people see where they are. And how they look and see where they are says a lot about how they understand their relationship to these places. How they relate to ideas like nature, to gender, and we've had some really interesting insights into the way that these dynamics play out. I want to just end then by mentioning why I think the particular way that these photographs invite us to view is relevant and significant for us now in the 21st century. During the 20th century, both in America and in Scandinavia, there was an idea of wilderness that grew, and in a lot of ways was catalyzed by Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring, which by all accounts is the kind of the birthplace of modern environmentalism, both in Scandinavia as well as in the United States. Carson was presenting us a rather dire picture of the use of chemical pesticides in the environment. And from what the work that Carson did together with other discourses came to formulate a kind of environmentalism that saw humans mainly as the problem, to put it in kind of really basic sorts of terms. And so the presence of the human was always the problem, right? So real wilderness, true wilderness, didn't include the human, right? Nature is out there, the humans are in here, and when you begin to mix them, that's when you get troubles. The problem with this kind of discourse is that it doesn't properly account for the fact that humans are in fact part of nature, that we engage and we participate in natural systems. The only conclusion that it eventually leads to is that humans need to be gotten rid of if nature is going to thrive. That doesn't do us a lot of favors here in the 21st century, where we're in what has been described as the Anthropocene, right? And that the power of thinking about our current geologic epoch as the Anthropocene is recognizing that for better or for ill, humans are part of this, and that we need to think through how we're connected. The power of these photographs is precisely how it's already doing that. You see how that there's actually a tradition that goes farther back that can imagine human participation in these kinds of landscapes in a way that that perhaps has the beginnings of this kind of domineering colonial type of aspect, but as well it has a very easy and free relationship between humans and the places that they inhabit. And this becomes an important starting point for us, I think, here in rethinking our own position in the 21st century, about thinking about how we relate to landscapes, how we look at landscapes, how we engage with them, and of course how we treat them as well. So those are some thoughts that have, I think, come together in some really interesting and powerful ways from the presentations here. So thank you.